Hello there, everybody. This is AW, and hopefully this thing can focus. Can't tell if it can or can't. Sorry. Stuff on my mind. I'm having a shitty day, so best way to solve a shitty day is get outside and take a nice long walk. As always, there's my little buddy over there. Hey, Dan. Hey there, other viewer. So, anyways, topics to hit on. Pierre and I were up until like what? I think like 1 a.m. listening to, well, not listening. We decided to continue reading Giorgiani's book, Atlas and Prometheus. We read the first chapter called The Spectral Revolution. Interesting chapter. I think, well, I've talked about this before. Nothing much new about the concept. It's a rather straightforward concept. The majority and bulk of that entire chapter essay is interesting in that it really goes into detail into Freud and how spooked Freud was about psychic phenomena, and that Freud was absolutely convinced that it was real. Stuff I had never heard of, but it comes directly from an essay by Derrida. I had never heard that Derrida was interested in weird shit, but he has two essays which are very focused on specifically weird shit, telepathy and Freud. And there's one specifically titled like on telepathy, which is mostly about like what he learned about how Freud thought about it. And the other one is called Spectres of Marx, which is not really about Marx so much as it is about literally Derrida going on about how the experience that he had, which was an anomalous experience in which he had a synchronicity, he thought about calling a friend, and as he reached for the phone to dial for his friend, the phone rang and it was his friend who he wanted to call, and that spooked the shit out of Derrida, and he started taking weird stuff seriously. And apparently that whole essay is structured around the consequences that Derrida expects for the reality of such things, and how it would just completely destroy our worldviews. So the whole spectre thing is where Giorgiani gets this idea of the spectral revolution of how everything is itself spectral. Not only are specters, the ghosts that haunt us, whether they're real ghosts or not, this otherworldliness, weird stuff that breaks into our everyday sense of reality and forces us to rethink things. The specters are also the very points of views and understandings we have of the world and experiences we have of the world, where everything is spectral. Everything's a ghost in Giorgiani's view, in which not only are the ghosts ontologically ghosts, our own epistemologies are ghosts, and then our beliefs are objects, and the belief about reality being a set thing is also itself a ghost. So everything is ghostly, and nothing really exists in a substantial sense. And that you would think that spooks. No, I think it would spook most people out. That kind of evanescence of objectivity is something that a lot of people find terrifying. Of course, Giorgiani and I do not actually find that very terrifying. I think Giorgiani revels in a part of that which I'm not quite convinced with, but if it's real, what the hell, why not? I mean, Giorgiani goes to the extreme. I don't know if you know Hegel, you've read The Phenomenology of Spirit, at least maybe the first, second, third chapter. About this whole thing about the forms of consciousness and how Hegel talks about the object being constituted by cognition. And so there's this basic sense. Come on, get over here. So there's this basic sense in which this goes on into a form that is very mundane. It's such as like, oh, well, what you perceive of objects is based on limitations of what you think objects are. But we all know that we have experiences of things which aren't based on things that we know, and yet we realize these are new things, and therefore, it's not simply, oh, well, my mind creates the objects of the world, it's the way I see things, is how things must appear. It's rather, that it has a certain kind of limit, but you still believe there's an objectivity to the world out there as a world, And Giorgiani kind of goes full extreme and says, no, really, it is true that he thinks that somehow the very beliefs we have about the world, the very ways we cognize about it, really ultimately constitute the world. But of course, he's not talking about like a aware, conscious cognition. He's talking about the Freudian kind of cognition, the unconscious. That the unconscious, manifests objects in the world, behind our back. And so stuff like that gets very spooky. I think he means it constituting like the ultimate sense, in that it's a sort of absolute idealism in a sense, or an objective idealism, where what we deeply believe, like it's not based on what we consciously believe, but what we deeply believe is what makes or drives the reality of the world. So the world is not reduced to us, but we have a significant constituting part in it. And let me let the people pass by. Bring your bad boy.
Thank you.
No problem. Being bad. So that's sort of interesting. But anyways, I actually want to just talk about the whole thing about Derrida. So Derrida has that experience with his friend, and that spooked the fuck out of him. There's also Freud. Freud apparently was into that stuff for quite a while. And it's kind of funny, I had never heard about this, that this happened, that Freud actually did come out near the end of his life and actually made a public announcement saying this shit's real, get on it. And it completely backfired. People thought he was crazy, and Freud actually went to like one of his top proteges at the time. This was past the time where he had broken with Jung, and told him, look, just say that I'm Jewish, say that I'm crazy, I'm old, I smoke too much. Forget about it. Just say this is my private belief, and it has nothing to do with anything. What happened there? Am I still online? Somehow, like the visor thing turned off. So, anyways, so that's an interesting story. And before that, Freud was into that stuff for a couple of decades. So, even when Jung was around, we all know that Jung was into weird shit. That's not a mystery to anybody. But I literally never had heard that Freud was into that, and that Freud was absolutely terrified. That Freud actually ran experiments. He didn't just believe it. He actually did experiments with his daughter and a couple of other friends who were into it. And they ran some telepathy experiments multiple times, as well as some mediumship experiments. And Freud wrote them all down in private, diaries. And Freud actually wrote multiple private essays that he wanted to give talks on over the years, but he always, backed out because he was afraid of the backlash that he would get. But he was terrified of that stuff. And as far as, I don't know, you may want to call him crazy. I don't, because you all, or at least you should know, I believe in weird shit. I'd like to say I know weird shit is real, but I haven't had anything weird specifically happen to me. But I know people, and I don't think they're all lying. And so people like Freud, Freud says he experienced it. I believe Freud. Yeah. Like his psychoanalysis went into disrepute anyway, so I don't know what he cared about. But yeah, Freud thought that. Freud apparently has some essays. I doubt that they're translated into English. Apparently, he has some essays about how he wrote about how the revolution of the psychoanalytic unconscious would not be complete until people realized that this telepathy shit was real, that the psychic phenomena was real, and that would break loose the gateways of hell for him, because it would ruin everything that we believe about objectivity. It would make the human psychic unconscious an absolutely powerful and terrifying objective force. So the subjective would become objective. And so, interesting. So beyond that interesting stuff, it was actually one of the most interesting chapters. Most of it focused on actually a critique of people who are skeptical of this stuff. About how the regular notions of science. I learned some things. I don't know if you know about the Thomas Kuhn, famous in philosophy of science. Technically, usually the second founding of philosophy of science after Popper. And I had read the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I thought it was pretty good. I had the second edition, but I suppose I just didn't read it enough because I didn't read the stuff in the afterword. And apparently, Kuhn ended up being a materialist reductionist physicalist. What would be an epistemologically solid foundation for belief in weird shit? Giordani says the belief in weird shit is literally the belief in spectral. The belief there is no hard distinction between anything, that anything is provisional and only pragmatically true. So that all things are considered models. Everything is in the Baudrillardian sense. Just maps. But we don't make the Baudrillard, yeah, Baudrillardian, or is it Baudrillard? I think it's Baudrillard, right? Baudrillardian step to say, that we've come to see the map as a territory. Says Giordani is the opposite. He says the only proper epistemology is to realize that all maps are not the territory. In fact, that many of the things we thought are territories are actually maps. And therefore, once we understand that everything is just pragmatic models, that none of it really maps onto the reality as such, that, reality always exceeds anything that we can conceptualize, only then do we start approximating, a proper stance of truth, in which, we can now deal with the spectral phenomena of weird shit, in which once it appears, we're not going, oh God, the world's going to end, or oh my God, this can't be true, this must be reduced to something else, or I must, do anything possible to deny that it's real. So, it allows you to accept both weird shit. It leaves you open to the possibility of anything, so long as, it's not just anything goes, but it leaves you open to the possibility that anything that shows any determinate being, if it seems you can study it, why the hell not study it? There's no shame in it. There's like right now there's a lot of shame in a lot of things, which have no reason to it other than we have a religion of beliefs. Both in science and anywhere else. You can't go against Einstein nowadays, for the most part, because how dare you? Einstein, built the modern physics. He built the modern world. Our clocks wouldn't work. GPS wouldn't work if it weren't for Einstein's theory of relativity. When people say shit like that, they're fucking dumbasses, because they don't even know how GPS works. They don't even know. You hear that a lot, by the way. Look it up, and I guarantee you'll find it overwhelmingly. People say, "What's the proof of time dilation and beyond the other experiments?" The number one is GPS. As if we are too fucking stupid to back engineer an equation about the equations of clock retardation or acceleration. So that stuff is simple to solve without relativity. It could be done easily, and you wouldn't have to have any weird spooky theories about time. What's my personal belief on it? My personal reason for believing in this stuff is that there's an overwhelming amount of literature from people who I respect. They're not nobodies. They're not the common person who I can go, oh, well, you were just seeing shit. You saw an owl and you thought you saw a witch or a demon or whatever. It's not that level of thing. There are things in which, like, I'm pretty skeptical of, honestly. If somebody comes in to see me and says, like, I can heal you, just with a touch, I'm like, okay, prove it. I'm not gonna pay you, unless you prove it to me. If you say you can do weird shit, I want to see that you can do weird shit. But seeing as I have no access to any people who claim to be doing weird shit, or let alone who can do weird shit, the only other people I have close to me are family members and friends who have had weird experiences, which are not the kind of experiences that you would expect, even a normal, gullible person to be making up, because they're very specific. For example, a family member of mine has an experience of a story they told me where they went somewhere with a family member, and they were looking at a house, and they went in there, and that family member, is kind of like a bit wonky, has some issues, but then she started describing that she was seeing the place as if there were people there, and she was describing the people she was seeing and what was going on. What kind of things led to certain damages in the house and whatnot. And she recounted that as they were in there. Meanwhile, somebody else was outside talking with the seller, and the seller was telling them about why the house was in the shape that it was in, and blah blah blah. Anyways, they went back outside. They went back home. They told the story. And it turned out that what the person inside was talking about, what they were seeing, was exactly what the seller outside was telling the other person what had happened in the house. And they asked me, how the fuck can you explain that? And I told them, well, honestly, I can't. What do you want me to tell you? I can't fucking explain that. Can anybody explain that? I don't think so. Weird shit like that has happened. Other people have had just kind of very strange specific premonitions. Those are less convincing because they're kind of dream premonitions and they're vague, but nonetheless they're interesting. But the main thing that convinced me is, frankly, the people I respect, that they are clearly intelligent people with PhDs. Who are even scientists, who believe in this weird shit and swear by it, and they've worked with it. And the only reason you never heard about it is because, well, it's it makes you persona non grata. It's not something that's talked about in academic circles, as part of polite society. Other than that, what am I going to say about these people? That they're lying, that they're hucksters, that they're just snake oil salesmen. Well, most of these people aren't making any money off of it. It ruins your reputation. They're not selling anything. They're putting out these weird shit, and all I can say is, fine. I believe they're not lying. I don't believe they're making shit up. I don't have to accept what they think it is. I always leave this open for myself, in which just because people experience something doesn't mean they know what they experience. So the main reason I also accept it is also because I have no good reason not to accept it. How would I know the a priori structures of reality simply do not allow for this? I used to say that, by the way, in which I used to say, well, no, a priori, just by the things that we know, this cannot be possible. No way. But once you get into the proper scientific literature and you get into philosophy of science, you realize that you have no grounds to say any of this kind of things. You are not God. You don't know the extents of nature. And just because you don't want to believe in things doesn't mean that things aren't real. So, I'm open to those things in which, if somebody was holding seances around here, hell yes, I would go. And believe you me, I would be scared. Yes, I would be scared. Because even if, there was a point in my life in which I thought, this is all bullshit. Nowadays, that the fact that you're open to it leaves you with a modicum of fear of like, well, how far does this go? And what can people do? And you always have in the back of your mind, there's some fucked up people in the world. Interesting story, Dan. But anyways, other funny things in that chat, Giorgiani, was the stuff, particularly on Feyerabend, the philosopher of science. Feyerabend wrote the book Against Method, and apparently in Against Method, he has some famous things which I'd heard about concerning his take on, the difference between, say, like, the one thing people really get him on and like people make fun of him for, and it's there apparently as a gotcha to get rid of people who aren't serious about reading the work and aren't serious about thinking about the topic, where he makes arguments for why astrology is as valid as astronomy, as for a scientific pursuit, in which he said, he even goes so far as saying that medieval theologians who wrote these long screeds against demonology and heretical doctrines and whatnot, and he says those people were more enlightened and far more knowledgeable than the like most science books today, precisely in that these people at least took seriously their opposition and learned about it, as opposed to people nowadays who simply dismiss things that they don't like and just mock it. And I think that in that manner, I'm bound to agree with Feyerabend in that it's a worthless pursuit uh, to be attacking things that you don't understand. People who dismiss UFOs, for example, don't know shit about UFOs. They don't look at anything. They haven't even watched a documentary, honestly, which is the easiest thing, easy peasy. You can watch some interesting documentaries, and they're not all convincing. There's plenty of. Most of the interesting stuff is actually in books, where you get these long list of records of all these like military and other things that were gotten from reports. And so there are radar records, there are pilot records, testimonies, multiple things. Did the stream break for anybody else? What are you doing? So sorry about that. What was I going on about? Speaking of which, somebody asked yesterday. I mean, you see all these trees. Okay, those are mostly lemons, I think. Mostly lemons on this side. And then on the far side, there's like this small grove of these weird, super small, like yellow lemons, and like these like super tiny tangerines. And they're delicious. Like you can just like snap them open and just like eat them up. It's pretty awesome. I didn't even know they were here because I usually just kind of go up the hill here. But I walked around yesterday in that direction, and I found them, and I was like, holy shit. And I took like something like 20 of them and ate them all on the way up to my car. But anyways, astrology. So Feyerabend's going on about how we got to take some things in astrology seriously. He's like, what's crazy about the idea that the stars, could affect, a person's in some manner. He says, well, there are plenty of things even in our current paradigms which tell us, obviously, this must be true. Obviously. I mean, we don't understand how much it would be, determinative, but surely it must have some determination whatsoever. The fact that, Mars was closer or Jupiter was farther, or, the constellation of Aries was in this way. We tend to just throw astrology out and say, oh, well, that's kind of nonsense. And how he also argues about how people mock the astrologers for saying, look, when people have the same sign, they're like, look, they're not the same. And the astrologers respond, well, the signs or the zodiac disposes, the stars dispose, but they do not determine. And they laugh at them and say, see, you don't have an actual theory. And Feyerabend says that has to be the most dumb response ever, because every other science has the exact same thing. We say that about us all the fucking time. You're born with genes, your genes dispose, but they do not determine. You have, you come from a long, angry backline, from a line of angry people, you're likely to be... all right, sorry. Where was I? Stream's back up, sorry. So what was I saying? Feyerabend says something on the lines of, the idea that there can be a determiner that isn't, very determinate, isn't completely determinate, is not nonsense. And so I thought that was kind of funny, and I think like he was, well, no, it's not that I think. I've seen this as a reading of it, and that people claim that if you read the rest of the book, he's not, trying to be as gullible as you think. That the whole point of the astrology thing, though, is there to open you up to the reality that you cannot fully dismiss everything, or because even the weird shit has some level of significant truth that can be taken in some way. And so complete dismissing it without understanding it is horseshit. And so stuff like that, pretty interesting. But anyways, moving away from weird shit, I talk about weird shit enough. I think I was talking about UFOs. If you dismiss UFOs, if you're not convinced about the reality of UFOs, look into it. That's all I would say. There's literature that's very interesting. I'm convinced that there's something. I'm not going to tell you they're aliens, because I am not convinced that they're aliens. I don't know what they are, but it's something bizarre. Definitely. Sup, Pavilas, whatever. Can't say your name. So moving on. I had an insight this morning at 3 a.m. As is my luck, good things come with bad things, and so I remembered something that I should have done this week, and boy, it kind of ruined my night. But nonetheless, the insight was nice. I don't remember what the hell I was reading or doing, such that it just popped into my head. And it was an insight in which I went back to something I've written before. I wrote an article for Epoche called, Hegel's Philosophy of Learning, on the Ala Minerva or something. And it's basically about how Hegel's philosophy is all about recollection, and it's you do and then you recollect. You learn by doing, and you recollect what you've done, and that becomes thought. So if you know Hegel and Marx, there's a famous phrase by Hegel about that insofar as we may ask philosophy for teachings so that it may guide us into the future, Hegel says that's not possible, because philosophy only comes at the falling of the dusk. The Ala Minerva only raises its wings with falling of dusk. And so if you know Marx as well, that Marx specifically criticizes this point of view, and indicts Hegel for being conservative. And a lot of people have a problem with that. The idea that, well, what good is philosophy if you can't tell us what to do in life? And I think that is misunderstood in a certain way. And I think it has to do with the nature of the future and the past. And it has specifically to do with the nature of the logic as well. So the logic works in that either you posit objects which show themselves to be activities, or posit activities which then become your objects. Either way, it doesn't matter. The full circuit is this coming back and forth between the activity is the object all at once. When you put that into concrete terms, Hegel has this famous phrase also from the lectures on the history of philosophy, where he says, philosophy is in truth only the history of philosophy. If you understand how the logic works, you understand perfectly well what this means. That if being is nothing and these are becoming, being and nothing are the history of becoming, and becoming is nothing but the process of the history of being and nothing. And so it's how thought is also always its own history. What thought is the history of thinking, and thought is only acquired by thinking of thinking, and so therefore thinking is its own history. And so if that makes sense to those of you who are watching, let me know. I mean, it makes sense to me, but I'm used to speaking in this self-reflexive, self-referencing style, and it makes perfect sense to me, but probably doesn't, might not make sense to you. But anyway, so if that is the case, when we talk about the future, we're talking about something that has not yet come to be, something that has not yet been done. And when we're talking about that, we're not talking about just the temporal future. You can talk about the future of the solar system, and we know that we can predict that for, the next, I don't know, million years or some shit, in which, we know the entire future up until then. There's interesting things that are not just remarked by Hegel, but by plenty of other people, especially, just A lot of mystics and people like life psychologists, in which the idea that that which is known is truly past. And I think Hegel also says something very similar in the philosophy of nature, where he says, that the future is actually a past, in retrospect. But when you have a genuine future, you don't know, and you cannot know what that future is going to be. And this is not just in the sense of, well, I don't know what I'm going to be doing, next Thursday night, specifically, at this time. Like we know generalities about that. You're like, well, I think I'll be alive. I think I'll be at work. I think I'll be writing something. Don't know specifically what, but it's probably going to be some kind of story. Usual stuff. We know certain stuff like that, and in that sense, those things are already past for us. They're not new. They're not really future. So futures here is meant in the sense of a categorical kind of future of a type of experience that has not yet occurred. It's like the idea that you cannot know before you know. That's nonsense, right? That you cannot pre-think, that you don't pre-think your thoughts, you think your thoughts. You don't precognize, you just cognize. And when you're doing and engaging in genuinely fresh, new future endeavors, it's impossible to, well, theoretically foresee them. Basically, nobody sees, in theory, any revolution, ever. Nobody foresaw, in theory, Einstein's revolution. Nobody foresaw, in theory, Newton's revolution. There are elements here and there, but nobody takes them to that sort of seriousness. And so, what is revolutionary is also unseen. And so, what I'm talking about here is also part of why revolutions cannot be theorized, in that a genuine revolution. Hello, Paul Gregory. Am I talking about the event? I haven't read Badiou or the other people who talk about the event, so I don't know what they mean. But if they mean something like what I'm saying, then sure, yeah. I'm talking about how the future is categorically futuristic. It's not. It's something. It's a kind of thing. It's not just a temporal, material moment. So you cannot foresee who you're going to fall in love with, for example. You cannot foresee what love is like before you've experienced your romantic love, and all these other things. Yeah, so it can't be predetermined. So stuff like revolutions are like that. So the idea that you're going to sit and create a theory for your praxis is completely backwards. And Hegel's claim that the owl of Minerva only raises its wings at the falling of the dusk, that philosophy always comes too late. If you understand philosophy as Hegel understands philosophy, which is this process of recollection, you understand then perfectly well why Hegel then says that. And he says philosophy cannot tell us what to do. Insofar as what we ask when we're asking what do we do is we're asking somebody to tell us what we already don't know. But if we already don't know it, they can't tell us. Because they're just in the same situation as us. The philosophers here are in the exact same society as we are. They're not ahead. So they can't tell us what to really do. Likewise, you cannot pre-theorize a society that way, which is why something like utopianism will always remain abstract. It cannot be a philosophical endeavor in the sense that philosophy is this necessary retroactive recollection. And so Hegel says philosophy can't help us, but he doesn't say we are helpless with regards to the future. He doesn't say this. He might, but I think that then what that leaves open. So what that leaves open is that the future belongs not to philosophy, but to open speculation in the dream kind, in the wish kind, in the kind that is utopian, that has only a certain basis in reality, but is not fully yet in reality. But precisely because it has not yet happened, it cannot articulate, its full determination. Therefore, the promises of revolution must always be provisional. They must always be things that cannot be certain, things that, precisely because revolution is something futuristic and not yet known, not yet done, not yet experienced, nobody can promise you that they will succeed. Nobody can promise you that they will actually deliver what they intend to deliver, because it might so happen that the experience shows that in the attempt it's just not possible. That it wasn't doable. But nonetheless, we don't know prior to doing it whether it can or cannot be done. So it leaves it open so that neither side can go and say, well, you can't do it, because they don't know, nor the people who say they can do it, because they don't know. And so the future is genuinely futuristic, uh, precisely because we don't know it, and precisely because we don't know it, we must always take these blind leaps of faith, of action, and it is the action which then will reveal the truth of the reality. So that's the interesting insight that I had. So I'm going to write an article for Epoch about that. Hopefully it won't be the usual 5,000 word long thing, but it probably will be. Right now it's somewhere about 2,000 words. But the main thing I want to talk about there is, kind of bridge this thing between Marx and Hegel and say, well, Marx is right to go against Hegel on this, but at the same time, it's kind of funny because Hegel's philosophy is the one that tells us why this cannot be pre-theorized and why he just remains silent. Because as philosophers cannot really tell us this future. Because if they're trying to do that, they're not engaging in philosophy, because they don't know. And what they're theorizing cannot actually be known prior to its reality. So the philosopher may decide, well, I don't want to be a philosopher in this moment. I want to offer something for the future. Therefore, I'm going to offer a speculative utopian dream, that we might attempt to reach for. And depending on, how good they are, I think they'll take into account the realities of our concrete existence. But the thing will always be vague, and the thing will always be highly abstract and open, precisely because it must. And and it's up to the people who are attempting to reach that goal to figure out what the reality of that goal will be. And the troubles that you find on the way there are the things that show you what the realities of the system really are. And so every society that is founded in this ignorance of its own future, in the ignorance whether its foundation will hold, and all that other jazz. And so in a way, it's kind of funny. Hegel's closed system suddenly opens up to something that is rationally irrational, if one may say that, because there must be a vision provided. There must. But then the questions arise as to can there be a revolutionary theory of revolution, and of how to revolutionize. And I think that if one looks around at any people who say that they have a notion of this or a concept of this, it's always vague bullshit. That's utterly meaningless and not very helpful. There's the people who say, well, it all comes from below. And they're like, it all begins with, you do this thing, and then you convince, a couple of people to do that thing, and they each convince a couple of people to do that thing, and hey, look, 50 years later, everybody's doing it. There's some empirical studies done about how supposedly it takes only about 10% of people, the 10% of a population, to completely swing the rest of the population around towards a new idea. And so people who look at that are like, oh well, all you have to do is just kind of you convince a couple of people, and they'll convince a couple of people. But does that always happen? No. You can't will that to happen. So that can't be a process of revolution, because that's just a haphazard thing. That's kind of just waiting for the right conditions to happen. So you're always shooting here and there, hoping that you'll hit a mark, and those people are always shooting here and there, hoping that you'll hit a mark. But it doesn't really function quite well that way. And so I think that there's an element of revolutionizing that is genuinely revolutionary, which is also just kind of a crisis of the moment. What is Chad suggesting humanity to avoid its end in this book? Chad is sort of taking the impersonal route on that, in which he says he's not afraid that humanity will end or anything. He's just saying, he's trying to put up a case for, look, things are going to change drastically to an extent that people don't even realize. That if peak oil happens, and we're all forced to lower our living standards significantly because of it, precisely because all that nice cheap oil is gone and the infrastructure of a society that was built on that is gone, the ideology and the mythology of society is going to change significantly along with it. Uh, so he's not suggesting anything to save ourselves. He actually gives an account in his book, which is interesting. I didn't know this, that he had originally quit his PhD program with another section of students, and they actually went and tried to start a commune up in Canada. I think it's Canada, and he said like it fell apart like within a year, and that really disillusioned him. And the people who remained ended up deciding, splitting ways, and some of them actually went and like lived out in the caves of Arizona. I don't know how you survive in a cave in Arizona, but God knows. Uh, I think it's in Arizona. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that, but it's in the book. Uh, so it's interesting. He actually went first for the personal route, and then that failed. That disillusioned him, and he decided. And then he also decided that being a philosopher, he thought that he needed to do something more universal. So he thought that spreading the word on peak oil and developing an account of how society is the way it is, and why societies generally follow the nature of their own energy supply and resources, um, was a better use of his time and efforts. As for me, if peak oil is a reality, my advice is get yourself a homestead, grow yourself a food forest, and hope to God that the climate doesn't fuck you. Because he gives a pretty funny story about how while he was writing the book, Oregon was given an award for being the most drought safe state in the United States, and literally the year that it was given an award, it had a drought. And so Chad says like, well, there's the irony about thinking that you can be secure from the elements of nature, if you can foresee these things. The truth of it is, you can't make absolute precautions. You got to ultimately accept that when your time comes, your time comes. Otherwise than that, all the best you can do is spread the word and try to live an ecologically sustainable life on your small scale. But he's not a moralist, so he's not telling you have to do this. So it's not like a green thing. He doesn't believe those things work. He hates moralism. So do I. What else was it that I had in my mind? I don't know. Any questions? By the way, I don't agree with Chad about the catastrophe of peak oil. I think it's definitely a catastrophe, but I don't think it's a permanent catastrophe. Chad takes it to be that we will never find anything that can replace oil. I don't think so. I think there's things that point towards something that may be able to take over. But I'm not exactly hopeful that this will be immediately found. So maybe we'll have to go through 100 years of living back, in the 1900s era. But an experience with Bataille. Only experience with Bataille I have is his essay on remembrance. I have a recording on that on my other channel, Left of Wreckage, where we read his thing on remembrance and Hegel, and I thought it was interesting, but somebody in the comments told me you missed out all the subtlety, and I'm like, I don't doubt it, because I don't have a background in Bataille, and apparently that assumed background in a lot of things that he talked about. Frankly, the only thing I found interesting in Bataille that I makes me want to read him is his novels. I've read about his novels, heard about them a little bit, and I'm like, it's kind of like Desaad. I'd like to read Desaad just to see how depraved it is. Other than that, the other thing is there's some book I once got and I never read it about this one semi-conservative philosopher, political philosopher in some no name university out in the Midwest, I think. Had an Italian sounding name, and rather than blame the Marxists, he actually blamed it all on Bataille and how Bataille was just the incursion of this uh, satanic, occult, demonic, sway of unreason, upon the West. So cultural Batailleanism, that's the real culprit for the decline of the West. Interesting book. I forget what it's called. The Tyranny of Ideology, or the Ideology of Tyranny. I forget. It's an interesting book. I mean, you read the blurb. It's. I'll see if I can post it. I can't do anything on my phone right now. What's your view on Zizek's Lacanian Hegel? Seems to work for me. Honestly, I don't read Zizek. I'm not really much of a fan of Zizek. His erudition drives me crazy. It seems to me that Lacan has something valuable to say, but at the same time, people who can't say things clearly drive me crazy. I can excuse people who couldn't say things clearly, but I have the distinct impression that Lacan and a lot of the French could say things more clearly and just decide not to. And that's bullshit in my opinion. What are the branches of philosophy that don't attract me? Probably most specifically it would be logic. Formal logic, for example, classical logic, I have no interest in. No interest whatsoever. Before it used to be aesthetics. I had no interest in aesthetics because I used to believe that aesthetics was bullshit and it was just relative. And therefore aesthetics didn't exist. It's until, about like 2 years ago that I really got interested into aesthetics because I did some aesthetic analysis of movies and I realized that's what I was doing, and I was like, holy shit, how can I understand this? So I started looking into certain things. Well, existentialism isn't a branch of philosophy. Come on, existentialism is a mode of philosophy that is really just one side of metaphysics. It's one form of metaphysics. I know that they say they're not metaphysical, but it's metaphysics. I mean, it's one way to view the world. Because as far as the branches of philosophy, what is it? Metaphysics, I like. Epistemology, I like. I had a phase. Actually, my initial phase was epistemic. Then it became ontological. And then I never went back to epistemology as such because why would you? Honestly, once you get to the comprehension of the German idealist about what the issues are about ontology and epistemology, everybody else looks like idiots. Everybody else. People are still talking about empiricism and rationalism and all these other shit, and here you are, and you're like, catch up. Yeah, I haven't read Lacan, so I've heard that he's unintelligible. I don't know. I'll give him a read at some point. It's just I'm not very interested. I have phases. So what was I going? Had an epistemology phase, ontology metaphysics phase. I had a Wittgensteinian linguistic philosophy phase. Had my materialist phase. Had my my philosophy of science phase. My ethics phase was actually mixed with my ontology phase because very quickly I came to the conclusion, and I've never deviated from that ever since, that ethics and ontology must be necessarily one. because you cannot. It's absolutely crazy to me for you to have an ethics that is not based on being. That based on the being of what we are. If you have an ethics that does not align or is not based on the kind of beings that we are, and therefore takes into account how we exist in this world, it takes account our emotionality, our sociality, all these things. If you don't have an ethics that takes that into account, you don't have an ethics worth shit, in my opinion. So my ethics has always been ontological ethics, and my original ontological ethics was Spinozist. I like Spinozist and Marxist, and I particularly was attracted to that because in Marx, for example, I saw this sort of ontological Aristotelianism as well. Aristotle has a bit of a duality and a monism between his ethics and his ontology, in which like the way he thinks of beings, kind of transposes into his ethics and his a virtue, and his virtue also kind of goes into being. Not so smoothly, but there are things in which they overlap significantly, I think. Is there a hierarchy of versatility to philosophy? Yeah, I think there is a hierarchy of branches. Um, the highest of the hierarchy, I would say, is logic, because logic is the philosophy of philosophy. Logic is meta philosophy, and in fact, that's also one of the things. People kind of sometimes talk about meta philosophy as like this other sixth branch. And I don't think so. I think that when you get to Kant, for example, even before Kant, you get someone like Leibniz, you get to those people, and you notice that what they think philosophy is that they think philosophy is metaphilosophy. And then you look at them in that light, because they focus on cognition, logic, and all these and they reach the points where, they almost have to get metacognitive. By logic, I mean ontology. Yeah, basically, ontology and logic end up being necessarily the same thing. Yeah. Although, when I'm talking like when you talk about a concrete ontology, you're talking about something existent. So you wouldn't be talking about being. You'd be talking about, specific kinds of being, which nonetheless are still ontologies. Capital is ontological. It's metaphysical, and you can transpose the logic of capital, say, onto other things, and show that it flows through them perfectly fine. And so, things that we normally don't think to be ontological end up being, well, quite ontological. As a matter of fact, most things, many mundane things, end up being quite ontological in logic. But it's always meta-philosophy. Like, philosophy is meta-philosophy. So, Hegel says philosophy is the history of philosophy. It's the same thing. Philosophy is the philosophy of philosophy. It's why the science of logic is, at the end of Hegel's system, as well as its beginning, where, philosophy, you go to the history of philosophy, and what is the final moment of the history of philosophy? That the logic is nothing but the recollection of the history of philosophy purified. What are you doing? But yeah, like an ultimate hierarchy, no, not really. If you understand the Hegelian system, there is no priority to any position. Positions only seem to be abstract or concrete depending on where you're bracketing the whole system. Logic ends up being more concrete than aesthetics, if where you began with is, say, the phenomenology, going up to that. Is there anyone beyond Hegel? I assume so. As far as like, has somebody come up with new categories that Hegel did not have? Absolutely. Are those beyond Hegel, and that the Hegelian cannot, bring them back into the system? I haven't seen a good example of that yet. Literally everything that I encounter, I go like, oh, well, yeah, this goes into this part of the system. Everybody says they're not Hegelian, but it always ends up seeming to me that whether they want to or not, they end up in the system. And just because they don't want to see themselves in the system, well, that's fine. Yes, actually, some people have said that Hölderlin is superior to Hegel. That Hölderlin both founded the insight of Hegel's logic, and Hölderlin also, in the same essay that founds it, destroys it. I read the supposed fragment on that. I don't see it, but I don't read German, so I don't know if there's more to that fragment, so I don't know. What are you doing? Quit being a pig. Come on. But the reason the system seems to be unsuperseded is because the system is based upon metaphilosophy. It is metaphilosophy. Anything that ends up being philosophy gets brought back into the system no matter what. Insofar as is rational and it's real, there's a way to hook it up to every single category no matter what people say about it. No matter how Heidegger says he's beyond reason, and that he's not privileging it, and that it's all about being genuine and being there, these practical relations to the world. Nonetheless, those are things that Hegel also talks about, and he doesn't talk about them to the same extent. It doesn't give him the privilege that Heidegger gives him. Yeah, those are systems. For example, somebody like Giorgiani says he's a postmodernist, post-structuralist. Sorry, people. Get over there. Quit being a bad boy. Quit being a bad boy. Okay, sorry, let me repeat that. So even all the deconstructionist, post-linguistic turn, etc. is either in system or just yeah, it's all in system. Because in so long as it's intelligible, you can bring it back into any relation of the categories that are intelligible. So, something like linguistic philosophy surely ends up somewhere within the philosophy of spirit or the phenomenology of spirit. A ton of those things, all forms of self-understanding lead to, the structure of the idea, the structure of the self, the structure of cognition, the structure of reflexivity. I think that the only thing that you can ever indict Hegel for is that Hegel was mistaken about where it ends. Even I don't think that Hegel, for example, manages to really capture everything. I think that he is mistaken about the completeness of his system. I think that there are ways in which he completely skipped over things that he shouldn't have skipped over. And so, there's always things to bring back in there. And I don't know a single critique that can escape the Hegelian critique. The postmoderns go like, oh, everything's social, everything's grounded in the unconscious, we're all, it's just a willpower, drives, blah, 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 whatever you want to call it, oil, substance. And the Hegelian will always say, well, the intelligibility of what you're saying is grounded nonetheless on the matter of fact that you're assuming an absolute standpoint of cognition, which you have left unexplained due to its reflexivity. And so, you're always either forced to admit that you're not actually putting forth an absolute position, and therefore your position is undermined, and you're not doing philosophy, or you're forced to admit, okay, well, I fall into the system, and the only response that I see for most people is, well, I just don't want to be in the system. I don't want to believe it. I don't want it to be true. Well, okay, whatever, man. I don't expect the whole world to become Hegelian. It's not my. I don't think Hegel cared. I don't care. I think it's interesting because I'd rather know if somebody could do a better job than I did in putting the world together. But some people don't want to have the world together, and that's their thing. there's getting deep into Hegel is just getting into Hegel. You'll lose your life on it if you actually try. But it's worth it. It's fun. I find it fun. I mean, I don't know. You look at stuff like Russell and whatnot, and I just find those things rather a waste of time. Not because they were meaningless, but rather that it's a level of articulation that ended up being useless. It's like you can talk about the projects. For example, in the philosophy of history, you can easily get into, putting the analytic and the continental movements separately as following different things and then converging again, because that's what's happening now. And in a way, it feels to me that most of it is pre-Kantian, but at the same time, it is also post-Kantian, depending, on what examples and what lessons they took from Kant. And so, at the point that we're at now, it seems to me like we've just returned to going back to the insights of Kant in the general populace as well as in philosophy. And so things like that, it's kind of like I ought to get acquainted with that a lot more. I used to be more acquainted, but once I find the older thinkers to be infinitely more interesting than any modern thinker I'm aware of. Like I'd rather spend my time reading Plato and Aristotle. Russell after getting destroyed by Gödel. Yeah, I don't know much about Russell. I'm not a fan of his. I think about getting into Greek ancients before Hegel. It'll help you. It's good. Yeah, physicists are very into Kant. I noticed that long ago, like when I first started taking philosophy, one of the people who mainly talk about Kant, who weren't philosophers, were physicists. Which is interesting, and I think it's because of the space and time aspect of Kant. That's what I mostly saw. It's kind of funny that the beginnings of the first times I saw Kant being talked about as something interesting. What are you eating? Quit eating trash. The first time I saw Kant being talked about by philosophers online was it's always the synthetic a priori shit. When you actually move away from that, the stuff just gets way more interesting. I mean, who the fuck cares about the synthetic a priori shit? It's not even the main question of the Critique of Pure Reason, ultimately. Kant starts with it and then just forgets it for the next, what is it, like 500 pages, and doesn't get back to it until the very end again. You have all these immediate deviations towards completely other things, which are infinitely more interesting and more meaningful than just the synthetic a priori being possible. It's also the case that a lot of people seem to misunderstand Kant to be, a subjective idealist. They think Kant is what is it, solipsist. So, we all know that's bullshit, but what are you going to do? So there's definitely a weird analytic heritage. I think the analytics are the ones who really care more about the synthetic a priori than anything. Most continentals care far more about the actual categories and other structures of the mind and the epistemology stuff. the things I had in mind. What was it? Can't think about it. I mean, in a way, like, what was it? I don't know when the heck I'm gonna finish Chad's book. I have a lot of books that I'm reading at once now, and hopefully I'll start working soon, and so I will have a lot less time, and gonna be choosing my books a lot more, a lot more based on my usual interests. While I find Chad's book interesting in general, uh, frankly, I'm not particularly interested in his outline of a new ontology of limitation or being. Mainly because I don't know. It doesn't. It's new, yes, as far as I'm aware. But at the same time, it's kind of like been there, done that. I read it, I'm like, oh yeah, of course. And I like to read stuff where it's not, oh yeah, of course. Well, it's like, well, damn, right? I mean, like, it's the kind of stuff I was talking about the future. I'd like to move on to the future rather than be reading stuff where like all that I'm gonna say is like, oh yeah, of course, yeah, that's like that other thing. Um, it bores me, and so interesting stuff, but not interesting enough. Main interest is far more interested in reading the Giorgiani book, which is about 100 pages longer. And actually, no, it's far longer because Chad's book is actually not that long. The spacing on the PD and the ebook is like double space, so it's actually only about I don't know, like irregular about 250 pages. Whereas Giorgiani's book is like 560 regular pages, and it's pretty long. But far more interesting because it's weird shit. And, it's weird shit I don't know about. And that's why I read stuff. Like I don't want to read stuff that I already know, or stuff that I can go like, oh yeah, like I already knew that. I just called it by another name. Um, gets boring. Gets really boring. So Giorgiani claims things like, well, reason isn't the ultimate thing. We have to have just this open-ended difference. And so this postmodernism, he thinks that, that it's better to think about nature through Schillingian aesthetic ideas, which, have this weird metaphysical power and, this occult shit. And that stuff is interesting because if somebody has something that can break Hegel, I would like to know. It's why I'm reading this stuff on Schelling and the philosophy of nature, because the claim is Schelling breaks Hegel, and I'd like to know if that's true. Because hell, if something's better, I'll take it. I think positivism is degradation of philosophy. Roughly speaking, philosophy as it was founded by Plato, it was precisely negative. Um, yeah, insofar as like Plato is the founder of dialectic in multiple senses, both as dialogue and as well as this. You know, there's what is it? The Parmenides is probably the closest thing to a Hegelian dialectic of an immanent critique of concepts, which ends as this sort of a. I don't know. I haven't. I read only a small portion of it, so I never finished reading it. So I don't know how it ends. But I've heard that's a pretty good one. Uh, knowing that what is it, the Critias and these other weird things like the ones Plato talks about, his cosmogony and cosmology and the story of Atlantis, that those are some you considered some of the later ones, and they're more mystical and weird. That's interesting. The fact that there's this article from a now defunct website, and I know it's on the Wayback Machine, but I can't. I'd have to look it up. Short article going on about how since we don't have anything that was ever like part of like the lecture notes from Plato or whatnot, unlike Aristotle, we don't actually know what Plato really taught, and what we get from Aristotle is pretty one-sided, and we can't really trust it to be completely faithful. And so that interpretation of Plato was specifically took Plato to be a meta philosopher, and it wouldn't be surprising at all, precisely because you look at how Plato goes about things. He was well aware of all the other philosophical systems and philosophers going on, and he was in dialogue with all of them, trying to bring them in to some degree within his system. And so something like that, puts Plato, at being one of the peaks. In fact, philosophy hardly gets any better, beyond Plato and Aristotle. It's amazing how close they came to solving it. If you read, I think I mentioned it before, that there's a couple essays from Winfield in across his books. One of them is in Hegel and the Future of Systematic Metaphysics, where he goes over the development from Plato to Plato on the idea of the good, the beautiful, and the true, and then also comparing it to Kant and then Hegel, in which, if what Winfield describes as Plato there is the case, can be comprehended as the case, Plato got incredibly close to getting at the articulation of what truth as such was supposed to be. That he came exceedingly close. So it's amazing that where Western philosophy supposedly begins, par excellence, was also almost where it ended. Had they just known just a little bit more. Yeah. As far as like Anglo philosophy goes, you think Richard Rorty was the highest point of Anglo philosophy? I don't know. I haven't read Rorty. Um, from what little I know, I'm not a fan of ironism. It seems kind of stupid to me, but at the same time, pragmatism as such seems kind of stupid to me. Uh, though at the same time, a pragmatic stance, a pragmatic philosophy is necessarily what a philosophy must be. It's just the nature of the pragmatism, pragmatism towards, just the efficiently practical or the theoretically practical. Because, you probably wouldn't hear this very much, though it's not a completely unheard of position, but I'm convinced that, we should call Hegel a pragmatist. That his whole philosophy is practical as fuck. That you can't really get away with Hegel if you don't engage practice. And that all that Hegel's theorizing is nothing but a theory of practice for the objects that he investigates. All right. Well, not much else to say, and it's been an hour. So, anyways, good stream, good chat. Thanks for the questions and watching. Hopefully, you learned something. Hopefully, you were entertained. Anyways, this has been Antonio Wolf. See you around.